Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the second lecture in our series of Understanding International Relations lectures. We will start today the concrete survey of the different theories that have been existing in the discipline since its creation some 100 years ago. And we will logically begin with the first approach, chronologically speaking, that is to say, idealism, which dominated the discipline during the interwar period. Let me remind you very quickly the two main points that we saw in our introduction. First, the definition of international relations as an object of study. International relations are those interactions taking place in an anarchical setting, in the anarchical international system, whoever the actors initiating those actions and interactions, be they states or not, and whatever the domain, political, diplomatic, strategic or not. And we saw also the definition of the discipline of international relations, when international relation is spelled with an uppercase I and uppercase R. We saw that the discipline is based on theories, and theories themselves are defined as sets of general statements based on empirical evidence and logically coherent argumentation, and aiming at accounting for what happens on the international scene, that is to say, describing how international relations take place and explaining why they take place the way they occur. Such theories, ladies and gentlemen, asking how questions and why questions, describing and explaining, have been existing for roughly 100 years now, and more specifically since 1919, when the discipline was created in the United Kingdom. There had been existing courses of international relations, notably in American universities before World War I, but within departments of political science. As an autonomous discipline, if not as an independent discipline, international relations, with its specific departments, with its scientific journals, with its research projects, professional associations, etc., and the specific courses, of course, the discipline has been existing since 1919. Emerged, was created in 1919. That is to say, immediately after World War I. And I think that to better understand the then prevailing approach and why it dominated the discipline at the very beginning, we have to go back to the historical background. It is the context of the immediate World War I, a period which contributes to explain the success, the emergence and the success of idealism. So let's have a look at the then prevailing historical context. In 1918, you know that World War I came to an end. When it had begun in 1914, almost everybody was convinced that it would be a short war, not too expensive a war, with only a small number of victims, with not that many destructions. Why? Because the wars of the 19th century had been limited wars. The 19th century, the so-called long 19th century, ladies and gentlemen, was a fairly stable, we could say peaceful century, at least among European powers in Europe. Things were different overseas due to the colonial, due to the colonial wars fought by the Europeans overseas, of course. But on the European continent, among European powers, no major war broke out between 1815, Napoleon's definitive defeat, and 1914, the outbreak of World War I. Only some limited wars occurred, 1853, 1856, the Crimean War, opposing first the Ottoman Empire to the Russians, and then the British and the French joined the Ottoman Empire against the Russians. The wars of the Italian unification, the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, and the wars of the German unification, opposing Prussia first to Austria and then to France, also were limited wars. And what's more, there were two significant periods of overall stability in Europe, 1815 to 1853, so 38, 39 long years, and 1870, France's defeat against the Prussians, up to 1914, a period of 44 years of stability. This stability, ladies and gentlemen, is ascribed by historians to the British hegemony, to the British preeminence. And this is the reason why this long 19th century is synonymous with what historians call the Pax Britannica. The British hegemony explains the stability through two mechanisms, two concrete mechanisms. The first one was the European Council of Powers that the British established in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat at the Congress of Vienna. This European Council of Powers consisted in the European powers meeting regularly in order to talk to one another, in order to establish an institutionalized dialogue, a regular dialogue in order to negotiate. And thus, these powers were able to find the peaceful solutions to their divergent interests, rather than using violent means, that is to say, rather than resorting to wars in order to obtain satisfaction. This European Council of Powers lasted throughout the first half of the 19th century. It came to an end roughly in 1848 with the so-called Spring of Nations in Europe. During the second half of the 19th century, the overall stability, which was not threatened by the limited wars, this overall stability was guaranteed thanks to Great Britain's offshore balancing strategy. That is to say, the British no longer organized regular meetings among major powers, but they resorted to what we may call a defensive power politics. The Germans call this Realpolitik, as opposed to a Machtpolitik, in English, offensive power politics. The defensive power politics of the British throughout the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, consisted in maintaining its overall preeminence on the world political stage, thanks to the regional balance of power on the continent among the four major European continental powers, that is to say France, Austria, Prussia, which became Germany after 1870, and the Tsarist Empire of Russia. By maintaining a balance between these four major powers, Great Britain guaranteed its own world political hegemony that it maintained also, of course, thanks to its colonial empire and thanks to its naval supremacy on the seven seas, on the world oceans. And this is the reason why Great Britain intervened in the Crimean War to prevent Russia to become too powerful in Eastern Europe, in Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans. It did not intervene in the wars of the Italian unification or in the wars of the German unification, because these wars opposed different continental powers among one another. So Great Britain, to some extent, was profiting, at least in the first period, from the different powers of the continent waging wars against one another. It was not directly concerned by these wars. So throughout the second half of the 19th century, Great Britain maintained the stability of the international system thanks to its offshore balancing strategy. This strategy, however, was conditioned by Great Britain remaining the hegemonic, that is to say, the materially preeminent power Great Britain, however, could not eternally remain the most powerful or the strongest power. Why? Because of the rise of secondary powers, which economically speaking became richer and richer. First, the United States, and then Germany, once unified after 1870. First, the Americans, and then the Germans matched Great Britain's economic resources. The fact that America became a major economic power was not a problem for the British. Why? Because the United States at that time practiced an isolationist foreign policy. They focused on the Western Hemisphere of North and South America, the North and South American continent. That is to say, they were what we may call a satisfied power. They did not try to get rid of the British preeminence. They accepted the existing status quo, the existing order. Things, however, were different with Germany, with Imperial Germany, which gradually became more and more powerful on the continent, thus upsetting the continental balance between France, Germany, Austria, and Russia. France indeed was weakened after its defeat in 1870. It lost Alsace-Lorraine in the eastern part of the French territory. Austria was also weakened because it was ousted from the Germanic space, and it was entangled in the Balkans, where the different units of future Yugoslavia wanted to get rid of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And Russia also was weakened because of its pre-revolutionary troubles that led to the Communist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and also because of its defeat against Japan in the war, the Japanese-Russian War of 1905. So the three out of the four continental powers were somehow declining, whereas Germany was very quickly rising, also thanks to its industrialization. Since then, the British order, the British preeminence on the worldwide political stage depended on the balance among the four continental powers. The fact for Germany to rise was a direct threat to the British preeminence. All the more so after, I would say, 1890, Bismarck was no longer the German chancellor. He had practiced a somehow moderate foreign policy. Things changed when Kaiser Wilhelm II, William II, the German emperor, got rid of, fired Bismarck, and launched his own Weltpolitik, was the German term. That is to say, he launched his expansionist world policy, aiming at having Germany wanted to have its own colonial empire, and Germany also was eager to become the first naval power by increasing its naval resources. So this revisionist Weltpolitik by a dissatisfied Imperial Germany constituted a threat for the British. What did then the British do? Since they no longer resorted to what they had done during the first half of the 19th century, that is to say, a kind of multilateral concert of powers, they went back to the traditional policy consisting in establishing alliances. They established an alliance with the two other European continental powers which felt threatened by the rise of Germany, that is to say, France and Russia. And Germany itself became an ally of Austria-Hungary and of Italy. That is to say, the international system at the end of the 19th century, at the very beginning of the 20th century, at the eve of World War I, the international system was no more unipolar, characterized by the preeminence of Great Britain, but it was bipolarized. That is to say, it was committed in a bipolarization process due to the creation of two rigid alliances, the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, Russia, opposed to the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This rivalry then was resulted in provoking the outbreak of World War I. World War I concerned all the major European powers, plus the Ottoman Empire, plus Japan. The Ottoman Empire joined the German alliance, Japan joined the Triple Entente, the US entered the war in 1917, and it permitted the British and the French to prevail over the Germans. You know that World War I, ladies and gentlemen, mobilized the entire populations of all these powers, and it caused the death of millions of people, either directly battle-related victims in Verdun, etc., or indirectly. We are living now in the pandemics of the coronavirus crisis. You may know that 100 years ago, the world was facing the Spanish flu pandemics, which also provoked the death of millions and millions of people. So World War I was a total war, and this will also be the case of World War II, of course. Being a total war, World War I created a kind of, was at the origin of a kind of psychological shock, because of the then prevailing belief that in the case of a war, the war would be short and not that destructive. So this psychological shock was due to the horrible events of World War I. And World War I refuted, belied the then prevailing conception of war as a normal instrument of foreign policy. You may know the definition of war by the Prussian strategic thinker Karl von Clausewitz. War is but the mere continuation of policy by other means. That is to say, it is normal for states to go to war in order to obtain what they are looking for in their foreign policy. This was the normal conception before World War I. Due to the huge destructiveness of World War I, this spontaneous belief or conviction was refuted. It was belied by the reality. And logically, some people, a minority of the then existing intellectual elites, came to the conclusion that something should be done in order to prevent a similar war from breaking out in the future. Among these people were philanthropists, and notably a Welsh industrialist, David Davies. What did he do in 1919? He decided to finance the creation of the first Department of International Relations, called Department of International Politics, where in Wales, at the University College of Wales, in the town of Aberystwyth, a town on the Irish Sea in Wales. And the aim of this new discipline, of this new department, of this new social science, was to, I quote, look for the best means to promote peace among nations. We have to establish a new scientific discipline. This was the objective pursued by David Davies. We have to establish a new scientific discipline in order to promote peace, in order to be useful for the foreign policy of states, in order to prevent a new world war from breaking out. The first professors, teachers, researchers in international relations, then, what did they do logically? They started their researches, their investigation, looking for the causes of World War I. If we want no more World War to break out, we have to understand why World War I broke out, and we have to avoid committing similar mistakes in the future. So the first international relations scholars looked at the prevailing political behavior during the end of the 19th, during the beginning of the 20th century, that is said roughly during the 20 years preceding the outbreak of World War I in 1914. And what did they see? Well, they saw that the 1990s and the first decade of the 20th century were characterized by the traditional alliance politics of major powers. Rather than talking to one another, rather than negotiating, as had been the case in the first half of the 19th century, the then prevailing power, I mentioned this some minutes ago, practiced the traditional power political game, consisting in establishing alliances, and then these alliances became rivals. The British international relations scholars, the first one that were teaching in Aberystwyth, thus came to the conclusion that the underlying theory that had inspired this alliance politics should be rejected and the new approach should be adopted. This new approach then was called by themselves the idealist approach. Idealism thus became the first academic theory in the discipline of international relations. Idealism prevailed in this discipline roughly during 20 years or so, up to the outbreak of World War I. Idealism is pretty often called Wilsonianism. That is to say, it is close to what the American president Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed in different speeches that he held after his decision to join World War I in order to defeat Germany and Austria-Hungary, in different speeches, and first and foremost in his famous 14 points speech. This 14 points speech concerned some detailed points regarding the concrete organization of the post-World War I world, notably how to find solution to territorial disputes, for instance, between Italy and then the newly created Yugoslavia. But among these 14 points, there were 5 major general points. Summing up, the Wilsonian or idealist vision of how the post-World War I international order should be organized in order precisely to prevent a new world war from breaking out. These 5 major points are the following ones. First of all, Woodrow Wilson wanted to put an end to the system of powers, to the power political strategy that had characterized the European international politics during the 20 years before World War I. So he wanted to replace the traditional balance of power strategy by, I quote, a general association of nations, a general association of nations, which was based on international law and no more on alliances. Second major point, he wanted to put an end to arms races. Arms races had been existing, notably the German naval arms race opposing it to the British. Arms races should be abandoned and replaced by a general process of disarmament. That is to say, states should start destroying, dismantling the weapons that they possessed rather than increasing the number of their weapons. Major point number 3, Woodrow Wilson wanted to put an end to what he considered to be old diplomacy, that is to say, secret diplomacy. The diplomacy of consisting in governments secretly negotiating without taking into account public opinion. So he wanted a public diplomacy in order to favor open negotiations. I quote, open covenants of peace, open treaties of peace, openly arrived at, that is to say, to which public opinions, rational public opinions, we'll come back to this point, would contribute, and thus put an end to the secret arrangements which had characterized European diplomacy of the past. He also wanted, point number 4, free trade to prevail, free trade and the freedom of navigation on the seas, in order to put an end to protectionist policies that had been adopted by the European powers in their foreign economic policy during the years preceding the outbreak of World War I. And last but not least, he wanted also to put an end to the colonial and imperialist policies of the European powers, that is to say, to the existence of the colonial empires, notably of the French and the British. These colonial empires should be replaced by the collective right of nations to determine themselves their political fate, the collective right of self-determination. So 5 major points which projected in his mind to change world politics. Wilson's impact, Wilson's influence on interwar idealists was direct. For instance, the first chair of international politics created at Aberystwyth was held by Sir Alfred Simon, who notably published the book The League of Nations and the Rule of Law, 1918-1935, and this chair was called Woodrow Wilson Chair. That said, Woodrow Wilson himself, and notably his major points, were influenced by a philosophical tradition, and more specifically by the liberal philosophical tradition. So idealism, ladies and gentlemen, is the first variant, the first version of liberal philosophy applied to international relations, and more specifically to international politics, as opposed to general or domestic politics. The liberal philosophical tradition is a centuries-old tradition, and in the domain of international relations, it is associated to 3 or 4 major political thinkers. Woodrow Wilson's appeal to open diplomacy as opposed to secret diplomacy, open diplomacy taking into account the public opinion, this point refers to what is called the democratic or republican liberal philosophy. Wilson's emphasis of free trade as opposed to protectionist or mercantilist economic policies refers to economic or commercial liberalism. And Wilson's allusion to the necessity to create a general association of nations based on the respect of international law is a reference to what we may call institutional liberalism or regulatory liberalism. To put it differently, Wilson and a bit later interwar idealists rediscovered and updated a centuries-old philosophical tradition. Their aim was to inspire the foreign policies of the then prevailing powers in order for peace to prevail, either through democracy or and through a free trade, economic interdependence, commercial exchanges, or and international law, international institutions. So let's have a look, ladies and gentlemen, to these three liberal traditions which constitute the core of idealism or of international liberalism as it prevailed throughout the interwar period. And let's start with democratic or republican liberalism, which goes back to Immanuel Kant. In his Perpetual Peace sketch, short essay of 30-40 pages, you can find it on internet. I invite you to have a look at it. Kant's Perpetual Peace sketch, published in 1795. According to Immanuel Kant, a republic, this is the term he used, he did not use democracy, the term democracy, but if we use contemporary language, what he called republic corresponds to nowadays liberal democracies, characterized by a separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. According to Kant, republics or democracies are favorable to peace and to perpetual peace. Why? Because by definition, in a democracy, the government is elected by the majority of the citizens. And according to Kant, this is typical for the liberal philosophy in general, the liberal political philosophy, individuals, citizens like you and me, are rational individuals, risk-averse individuals. That is to say, individuals who avoid useless risks. Now, a war, by definition, implies risks due to the very negative consequences of a war. If a war breaks out, citizens, or at least male citizens, have to fight as soldiers, or run the risk of having to fight as soldiers, as conscripts. All the citizens in the case of a war have to pay higher taxes to finance the cost of war. And all the citizens have to repair the destructions caused by the war if the war takes place on the territory of their own country. Now, given that citizens are risk averse, they do not want to have to bear all these negative consequences. And since they are at the origin of the democratically elected government, the government cannot decide to go to war without the consent, the agreement of the citizens. Therefore, according to Kant, a democracy is somehow spontaneously, mechanically, automatically prone to peace, favorable to peace. And the opposite is true, according to Kant, in the case of an autocratic regime, in the case of a dictatorship. By definition, in the dictatorship, the citizen's opinion is not taken into account because the dictator imposes its will, his or her will, upon the citizens who are not citizens, but subjects submitted to the authority, the autocratic authority of the dictator. This dictator then can go to war whenever it pleases him to go to war. All the more so since the negative consequences of the war will be paid by the subjects and not by the dictator himself. So according to Kant, in his Perpetual Peace essay published in 1795, democracies or republics, liberal democracies could we say nowadays, are a force for peace. This was the idea that was rediscovered by Wilson and by the different interwar idealists. Here are the names of the different interwar idealists. They are no longer that famous nowadays, but we can quote Simon, Engel, Hobson. We will come back to Engel and Hobson in 1 or 2 minutes. So, interwar idealists rediscovered Kant, but they updated this somehow very optimistic analysis of the positive or peaceful links, the positive links between democracy and peace. Why did he update it? Because they had witnessed what had happened in 1914. In 1914, when the war broke out, this outbreak was favored by a very nationalist public opinion, both in France and in Germany. Remember that in France, only one major politician was opposed to the war, Jean Jaurès. In Germany, only two radical left-wing politicians were opposed to the war, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, those who created the future German Communist Party. All the other politicians and the general public opinion was favorable to a war. So the interwar idealists came to the conclusion people, average people, are most of the time driven not by their interests or by their reason, by their rationality, but by their passions, by their emotions. So what do we have to do? We have to give them a new education in order for them to become rational individuals. And Alfred Zimmern, the one already quoted, came to the idea that a world library should be established in order to permit people who too poor to buy books to borrow books at this library, and thanks to this mechanism, to obtain an international or an internationalist civic education as opposed to a nationalist or jingoistic one that was prevailing in the then European school systems. So yes, democracy is a force for peace, according to interwar idealists, but at the explicit condition of average people, average citizens receiving an education likely to permit them to understand where their true rational interest consists in. It consists in peace and not in going to war against the neighbors. Second substantive idea of interwar idealists or of liberal internationalism, peace through economic exchanges, economic interdependence, or trade. This idea goes back to the French philosopher of the 18th century, Montesquieu, who in this spirit of laws, de l'esprit des lois, had put forward his famous du commerce thesis. Du commerce, translated in English by the expression trade, not invade. Trade is a force for peace because it convinces states that it is no more in their interest to invade their neighbors. Why? Because two nations, and you have the quote on the slide, two nations, two states, two economies that have trade with one another would be foolish to put an end to these trades by going to war against one another. Why? Because trade increases the welfare. in the two economies, or in the more than two nations, if there is an international, not merely a bilateral trade. This welfare profits the populations in all the countries concerned. So it would be irrational, it would be counterproductive for two nations that are economically, commercially interdependent. It would be foolish for them to go to war, because they would interrupt this trade, which has positive consequences for all the citizens. Look at the quote, peace is the natural effect of trade. Two nations who traffic with each other, who have trade with each other. Traffic was the then existing term. Become reciprocally dependent. Reciprocally dependent means interdependent. If one has an interest in buying, the other has an interest in selling, and vice versa. And thus their union is founded on their mutual necessities. So according to Montesquieu, a peace automatically, trade automatically is favoring a peace. Here again, the interwar idealists were not that, I would say, spontaneously agree with this very optimistic outlook. Why? Because they, once again, had seen what had happened before World War I. They had witnessed the tendency of the then European powers, France, Germany, Russia, etc., to adopt protectionist policies. That is to say, to put an end to free trade as soon as this free trade was not that longer positive for themselves. That is to say, when the free trade that had been existing profited more to one state, to one partner in the trade than to the other one, this other one decided that it should stop a free trade by adopting protectionist policies and even mercantilist policies, that is to say, by favoring its national industries rather than importing goods from the commercial partner. Having seen these protectionist tendencies, which had contributed to aggravate the power political rivalries among the different European powers at the eve of World War I, thus contributing indirectly to the outbreak of World War I, having seen these protectionist tendencies, interwar idealists then asked the question, how can we, what should we do in order for free trade to go on existing, even when it is not systematically profitable to all the members? And they came to the following conclusion, put forward notably by John Hobson, a friend of John Maynard Keynes, the great economist whom you know. In his book, The Conditions of Industrial Peace, John Hobson came to the conclusion that a free trade should be organized. That is to say, there should be a kind of international governance board, an international economic organization, permitting the different economies to have regular meetings in order to find common solutions rather than resorting to unilateral protectionist policies. So free trade is a force for peace for interwar idealists at the condition that the traditional laissez-faire, laissez-aller capitalism of the 19th century would be replaced by an international economic regulation. No more the invisible hand of market forces should prevail in international trade, but an internationally organized trade. And this is what will happen after World War II, when the IMF, when the World Bank, when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, were established. This idealism, gentlemen, goes back to the interwar idealists in general, and more specifically, John Hobson. The traditional savage international capitalism should be replaced by a kind of international welfare capitalism, an international welfare organization where states meet regularly and look for peaceful solutions of their diverging economic interests. Last but not least, the third substantive thesis of interwar idealism or international liberalism also considers the necessity of a reform of international institutions. This third substantive thesis is the so-called institutional or regulatory liberalism, which goes back to the philosophy, the political theory of the Dutch Hugo Grotius and the English John Locke. Grotius and Locke are two contractualist philosophers, that is to say, they claim that before the states were created, before societies organized themselves in political units called states, there existed among men a state of nature. And according to Grotius and Locke, in this state of nature, men already lived in peace with one another, though this peace was sometimes interrupted by violent interactions. And they then transfer their analysis of the state of nature among men to the state of nature or the state of anarchy. Remember what we saw last week in our introduction. They transfer the analysis of the state of nature among men to the state of nature among nation states. That is to say, they think that most of the time, nation states live in peace with one another. Thanks to what? Thanks to different rules, thanks to different principles that they do establish themselves and that they respect. Most of the time, listen to Grotius, among all of most states, there are some laws agreed upon by common consent. States have dialogue with one another and establish some rules, some laws. The aim of these laws is the advantage of all the states taken together. And he calls the set of laws concerned the law of nations. Remember what we saw last week too. The law of nations is what Bentham will call international law, the law among nation states composed by the different rules, the different norms that states promise, commit themselves to respect most of the time, thus permitting peace to prevail. International law contributes to peace. The same idea is put forward by John Locke. All commonwealths was the then prevailing term. We can say all states, all nation states are in a state of nature with one another, no authority above them. State of anarchy, would we say nowadays? There is no authority above them, but the grants, the promises, the oaths are bonds that hold the princes of the world. That is to say, when signing a treaty, the promises that they accept to make will be respected by the princes, and therefore peace is possible. This idea then will be at the origin of the creation of the League of Nations. Thanks to the League of Nations, interwar idealists, look at the title of Alfred Simon's book, The League of Nations and the Rule of Law. Thanks to the League of Nations, peace, according to idealists, was possible because the different states did promise not to go to war anymore. They promised to respect the agreements to which they were able to arrive thanks to the institutionalized dialogue at the League of Nations, you know that, which was established in Geneva after World War I. And the aim was to permit peace to prevail, also thanks to the major powers punishing, sanctioning those powers that did not respect the promise to go to war, not to go to war. The peace-loving nations, this is an expression of Woodrow Wilson, would get rid of the brigand powers. This was an expression of John Maynard Keynes, the brigand powers, that is to say, the different states that went on practicing aggressive, expansionist, ambitious foreign policies likely to endanger international peace. So 3 major points, and to sum up the idealist approach of international relations, idealism is synonymous with reformism. Idealists believe that it is possible to change the world, to reform the world from a fairly violent international stage into a peaceful international scene. Thanks to what? Thanks to education, thanks to organized, controlled free trade, and thanks to international organizations such as the League of Nations, replacing the traditional alliance of politics. The aim pursued by these reforms, ladies and gentlemen, was to replace the principle of power of politics by the principle of responsibility to some extent. And the underlying assumption, belief of idealists was the idea that sooner or later, the gradually more and more economically interdependent world would more or less automatically give birth to a world government. In the past, nation states, according to them, were separated from one another, just as their economies were separated from one another. But progressively, the national economies became interdependent. While the political reality was still consisting in separate, independent, sovereign states. This gap for idealists was a kind of contradiction, which should be overcome, which even would be gradually, progressively overcome. To put it differently, the growing economic and social interdependence would be followed, crowned by a political unification, the emergence of a world government. To some extent, ladies and gentlemen, this also is the underlying belief of the founding fathers of the European integration, the European community, which became the European Union. The founding fathers of the European community at the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, Schuman, Monnet, De Gasperi, Adenauer, etc., believed that through economic unification, first coal and steel industries will be put together in Europe. Thanks to this economic integration, sooner or later, Europe would form a political unity. So this belief basically stems from interwar idealism. The best means to prevent wars from breaking out among nation states is to create a world government. And according to them, this world government would be the logical crowning consequence of the gradually, progressively economic and social integration on a worldwide scale. So idealists were driven by a kind of very optimistic outlook, and therefore they call themselves idealists. It is possible to change reality. Idealists basically are children of the Enlightenment century. They believe in the capacity of human beings to learn from their past mistakes. They believe in the possibility for human beings to be reasonable, rational individuals, to overcome their shortcomings, to be eager to improve their overall condition, to prefer peace, to war peace thanks to international law and international negotiations rather than war through violence. So a very optimistic outlook. What happened, ladies and gentlemen, to this outlook? Was the idealist objective achieved or not during the 20 years or so? You know the answer, of course, no. It was not achieved. The idealist project was a failure. So let's come back to the historical evolution of the interwar period in order to understand why idealists were belied, refuted by the then existing reality. And let's look at the three processes thanks to which peace, according to idealists, should have prevailed. If we look at the success of democracy, what do we see? We see that during the interwar period, more and more major states were no longer democratic at all. Italy turned fascist at the very beginning of the 1920s. Japan became an imperial Japan at the very beginning of the 30s. Nazi Germany triumphed thanks to Hitler in 1933. So three right-wing totalitarian regimes and one left-wing totalitarian regime, the Soviet Union, as early as 1917. So only three out of the then seven major powers were democratic. So the peace through democracy idea of Wilson, of the interwar idealists, going back to Kant, was refuted by the evolution of the political reality, not merely in Europe, but beyond Europe. Regarding the free trade argument, things are a bit more complicated. Throughout the 20s, free trade indeed flourished again. Thanks to the British pound, sterling being replaced by the American dollar as the major international currency. But things changed in 1929 when the Great Economic Depression affected gradually all the Western liberal or capitalist economies. The Black Tuesday, October 29, that followed the Black Thursday of October 24, resulted in the Great Depression, which indirectly favored autocratic regimes, notably in Japan and in Germany. The different national economies, when confronted to this Great Depression, how did they react? Well, as in the past, that is to say, they adopted unilateral, protectionist, mercantilist foreign economic policies, rather than going on negotiating as Hobson had imagined in his publication. No international governance existed, and no international economic governance, existed, and was likely to be preferred by the national economies, the governments of the national economies, who resorted once again to unilateral foreign policies. As I already said, these international economic institutions will be established after World War II, to some extent, because of the lesson drawn by the Americans after World War II. Regarding the third major mechanism, thanks to which peace should be favored, peace through international law, more specifically through the League of Nations. The League of Nations also was a failure, ladies and gentlemen. It was established immediately after 1919, thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. The Charter of the League of Nations was adopted. The member states who signed the League of Nations Charter promised to no longer go to war. They accepted, I quote, the obligations not to resort to war. They committed themselves to promote international cooperation, to achieve international peace and international security, thanks to arbitration, thanks to judicial settlement, and no more by going to war. The League of Nations Charter was completed, supplemented by the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The states who signed it promised to gradually disarm. This was the disarmament which should put an end to arms races. You know what happened, ladies and gentlemen, to the League of Nations? It was unable to prevent Imperial Japan from attacking China and from creating puppet states in northern China, Manchuria. The League of Nations was unable to prevent Fascist Italy from invading Abyssinia, today's Ethiopia. And last but not least, the League of Nations was unable to prevent Hitler from remilitarizing the left bank of the Rhine River, from invading and annexing Austria, from invading the Sudetenland, the part of the then Czechoslovakia, and last but not least, from attacking Poland, thus provoking the outbreak of World War II in 1939, September the 1st, 1939. The League of Nations was a failure. Its achievements were far below the expectations of interwar idealists. How can we explain, ladies and gentlemen, this failure? Well, a first explanation is the fact that the United States itself refused to be part of it. That is to say, the Senate more specifically refused to sign, to ratify the Versailles Treaty because of its loyalty. The majority of American senators were loyal to the traditional isolationist policy, so they rejected Wilson's project of the League of Nations. What's more, Germany had been considered to be guilty of the outbreak of World War I, so it was not accepted in 1918, 1919 as a member of the League of Nations. It became a member a bit later in 26, but it withdrew in 33 when Hitler came to power. Japan was a founding member, but it withdrew in 1933 too. The Soviet Union, being a communist state, had not been accepted as a member. It became a member in 1934. It was expelled in 39 when World War II had already started. So, to some extent, the League of Nations did not reflect the power political configuration of the then interwar international system. Great Britain, and to some extent France, still believed that they were the prevailing powers on the international scene, but this international system was no longer European-centered. The new powers were not European ones. Japan, the US, of course, the Soviet Union, a bit European, but not exclusively European, given its location also in Asia. And the major European powers, as I already mentioned, were not appealing to the same values, given that some of them were democracies and the other ones, anything but liberal democracies. This is what Rémoiron, the French theorist, philosopher, sociologist, calls a heterogeneous system. According to Rémoiron, an international system can either be homogeneous or heterogeneous. A homogeneous system is a system composed by states, I quote, belonging to the same type and obeying to the same conception of policy. And that is to say, it is a system which is stable, peaceful, or only limited wars break out, because all the major powers are somehow satisfied with the existing order, with the existing status quo. They do not try to overthrow, to get rid of, to put an end to the existing system. Why? Because they share more or less the same values. They agree upon the same principles. And according to Aron, this had been the case during the 19th century. And opposed to this homogeneous system is what he calls a heterogeneous system, composed by states organizing on the basis of different principles, appealing to contradictory values. And such a system is unstable, war-prone, because some of the states or their statesmen are eager to overthrow the system in order to impose their values, because they no longer accept the values of the still prevailing power. This was the case during the interwar period, because we had the communist values of the USSR, the Nazi or fascist values of Germany and of Italy, the imperial or imperialist values of Japan in Far East. So this heterogeneous system, according to Rémoiron, could hardly be synonymous with a stable or peaceful system. Too many powers were eager to spread, if necessary by force, their vision of how the world should be organized. Aron's analysis is somehow joined by a more general explanation, which gradually emerged, ladies and gentlemen, during the 1930s. An explanation put forward by those scholars of international relations, historians or political scientists or international relations scholars, who rejected idealism because they were themselves realists. That is to say, they claimed that to believe in the possibility of peace, thanks to the spread of democracy, thanks to international law, and thanks to economic interdependence, to believe this actually was constitutive of an illusion. It is impossible to maintain peace thanks to law, democracy, and trade, because basically international politics is power politics. Only power can maintain peace thanks to different types of balance of power. This idea will be put forward during the 30s, notably by the American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr of German origin, in a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society, by another American political scientist, Frederick Schuman, in a book published in 1933, International Politics, an Introduction to the Western State System, and above all, by the British historian Edward Carr, who published in 1939, at some weeks before World War II broke out, a book called The 20 Years a Crisis, 1919-1939, the subtitle, An Introduction to the Study of International Relations. The three authors, and first and foremost Edward Carr, are at the origin of the new approach which will be dominating in the discipline of international relations after World War II, the so-called classical realist approach, which we will have a detailed look at in our chapter 3, that is to say, next week. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending today's class. I wish you a great day and hope to see you again in a week. Goodbye.